Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We will start the afternoon, or so to speak, post-lunch session. So we will try to have your attention after the lunch break. As you might know, I'm Csaba Tóth, Director of Strategy at Republican Institute, European Liberal Forum, and I will be your moderator for this second very prestigious and very exciting panel where we will discuss institutional challenges for the European Union. Allow me to introduce first and foremost our distinguished guests. Going from my right, Věra Jourová, who is Commissioner for Justice, Consumers and Gender Equality, of course, from the Czech Republic. Was previously Minister for Regional Development, and before that a consultant, if I understand correctly, but I'm sure you all know her much better than I do. To her right is Her Excellency Manuela Franco, from the Embassy of the Portuguese Republic, here to the Czech Republic. She had a number of diplomatic posts and postings before that, and also editing and other positions. To her right is Ivo Slosarczyk. Slosarczyk, did I pronounce it correctly?
No, Slosarczyk.
Slosarczyk, okay. Slosarczyk, okay. Who is a professor here at the Charles University, and who actually has a PhD as well from the Charles University, and attended also, which is very kind to my heart, the Central European University in Hungary. And to his right is Benjamin Haddad, research fellow of the Hudson Institute, and he was a member of the previous panel. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the organizers named this panel Institutional Challenges for the European Union, and we would basically have to discuss in the 90 minutes that we have the role of subregional platforms in the EU, their significance, what the EU should do about member states' domestic politics, if anything, what's going to go with the Treaty of Lisbon, what should be done with the European Commission, and who should make the decisions in Brussels, also the meaning of life, I would imagine, because of course those are topics very, very difficult to discuss. Institutional challenges are very difficult, notoriously difficult to discuss. Just to kick off the panel, I'm sure you all know the anecdotes about how difficult it is to determine actually who makes decisions in the European Union, who makes decisions in Brussels. In my experience, many people influence decisions, and not many people claim to make those decisions. Of course, if you lived in Hungary, you would know that George Soros makes all the decisions in Brussels, but I think outside of Hungary, that is not necessarily taken seriously. So the way I would want to do this is I would ask each of our panelists to identify the three major institutional challenges that they see within today's European Union, and we will see how much overlap there is, and then we will continue on from there. Also, as I remarked earlier, not only the challenges, but the possible solutions or directions to solutions are also very appreciated if you mention them. I asked the panelists in an email to limit their opening responses to 5 minutes so that we can have a lively debate, but of course I understand that these are tough questions, so if you go over time I will be moderately strict. And I think we can go with the order of sitting. Věra Jourová, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to meet you again here today. Yes, this is for hours and hours of debate, so I will try to be short. The main institutional challenges, I think, quality and transparency of decision making, and here we have to inevitably discuss whether the Lisbon Treaty, how it stands now, whether it fulfills such expectations. As you know, and we discussed it this morning, there were and have been several very, very serious challenges for the EU, where the expectations of people are that Europe should be more flexible and more quick and more transparent, so I agree with it. Nevertheless, we decided not to touch the Lisbon Treaty in the uncertain times, because we need it, and we still need some clearly steady, firm pillar. And this is the Lisbon Treaty, which I think, however, will be debated in the next mandate after the next election. So you might know that I already said it openly that I will help ANO party in this country to prepare the political program for the new mandate with very concrete proposals for the reforms which the EU needs, so that to have higher quality and more transparent decision making. This covers the decision about the matters which require unanimous or qualified majority voting. This will inevitably have to be debate about the role of different institutions and different procedural steps. And also we have to debate how to do and achieve the magic that if something is decided in Brussels, whoever decides. Of course, the Commission decides a lot of things, but it's, as for the legislation, it's always a proposal which has to be endorsed later by the two other co-legislators. But whoever decides, there should be very strong ownership from the side of the national representation. When the minister comes back home, so that he doesn't say, I had to vote for it because I had the gun close to my head, which is quite traditional, or very often. So that's the first thing, questions over the Lisbon Treaty and necessary reforms in order to have better quality and more transparent decision making. The second challenge is the communication. I think it's a disaster when I get very often the feedback from the people that they do not understand what we are doing and what we want. I was challenged recently by a very successful entrepreneur, a lady who owns a company which exports to many member states of the EU, and she said, what are you doing there? It's summit after summit, and what is it good for? And I remember the time before Bratislava summit, if you remember that, it was after Brexit, and we really didn't have a clue how we will continue. We needed a summit where the leaders will meet and will declare, yes, let's continue together and let's be unanimous, united, not unanimous, united, and let's be stronger together, and let's have UK as a partner, strategic partner, and let's do things together which will be possible to do. And the lady told me, well, I didn't know that it was such an important thing, and I realized how miserably we communicate what we are doing, that the people do not understand the basic things, maybe also because we want to explain too many things, we use strange jargon, we do not care about the way the people transfer our information into their way of thinking. I am a strong enemy of the homogeneous messages sent from Brussels directly to the member states. That's why I try to promote strong position of our permanent representation in the member states, so that they transfer the information for the local audience. I think that we have a lot of work here. So the second challenge is communication. The third challenge, if I still have time, you spoke about domestic politics. I think that we have a big gap still in explaining why the rule of law is absolutely existentially important. When we started to debate the Polish case, I can tell you I had a tough time to explain why the balance of powers is important. That it is not what we want in Europe, that the winner takes it all. That if the political party wins the elections, it doesn't mean that the party, the government will seize that they will capture the judiciary. The judiciary has to remain independent and continue in spite of the changes in the political sphere. Many people do not understand this basic principle. I was said, oh, Jourova, you got stuck on Montesquieu. We are in the 21st century, and I'm sorry, I still think that Montesquieu has something to say to us. And also Tocqueville and the democracy in America, where the same principle works. So I don't know why in Europe we should now deviate from this way, only because of some politicians want to fortify themselves forever, because they say, my people understand me. No, don't touch judiciary, keep the balance of powers. This is absolutely crucial. The constitutional balancing of power is the basic condition for the member states to continue. And you know that, you might know, I don't know if you are following what I'm doing, but I can tell you today that I'm a strong defender of the line between the respect to rule of law and the EU money. And if some countries now say, we don't like this condition, I must ask them, isn't it the minimum? You must guarantee the European taxpayers. If you want to get their money, shouldn't you guarantee the rule of law? Shouldn't you guarantee that independent justice will judge and punish the cases of fraud and corruption on EU money? Shouldn't there be the absolutely clear balance of rights and obligations in the system? Otherwise the system will crash. I think these are all the things which have to insist on, and it's the challenge at the same time. Rule of law is not an easy thing to explain, but we have to try again and again and better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Rule of law is in fact something that I think we will be getting back at, so I will be curious to hear those arguments. Those are not easy arguments, just because the principle is important, because of course, and I will challenge you on that. My government will say, well, why? Why shouldn't the majority have the right to make the constitutional system in its own image? So we might get back to there at that point, but let's see how the others see. Your 3 points were transparency, communication, and the rule of law. Let's hear then Manuela Franco, the 3 main challenges.
For the invitation and for taking such an interesting and heavy-duty panel. This institution. It's green. Is it working?
It's working now. Okay, thank you. So this, as I was saying, these institutional challenges for the Eurozone are a quite heavy-duty matter. So you will understand that I will be transmitting my government position on this. We see it as a very complicated, destabilizing political situation right now facing Europe. There is an accelerated change that is perceived by all. There is a transition period with no clear path ahead. It is difficult to find a way further. There is Brexit, whose consequences are to be feared but not exactly clear to the citizen on the regular news hour. There are very well perceived changes in the international system. There is the global redistribution of wealth. All these determining top-down changes and bottom-up changes and pressures on the European system, both abroad and at home, with the consequences that we are seeing in many of national elections. So, in a way, this lack of ready-made solutions is natural, but it also allows for huge anxiety on the part of the electorates and also on the part of those responsible for government, because they're used to provide solutions and sometimes they don't find it. So in this sense, I would bring to you which is our sensibility to this. I would like to state that in Portugal, we decided to join the EU in 1977 after nearly 50 years of dictatorship. We had a huge development gap. We had a huge literacy rate. We had lack of infrastructure. And most of all, we had a revolution and there was a political fight. We had a colonial war, we finished the war, we repatriated 1 million Portuguese people, Portuguese citizens living in the former colonies, and there was a big political fight going on. So the main reason to request our joining the European Union was that we felt it was the only way that we had to consolidate democracy at home. We counted explicitly on EU demands and intervention as a fundamental factor forcing the internal political sensibilities, parties, different factions to face that there was one way forward, which was to become a European state and not half colonial. We needed to set the state, the rule of law, everything needed the EU help. So as we built our democratic state along with the procedure of joining the European Union, so much so that you can say in Portugal that there is no Euroscepticism. Even with this terrible program, some people say that we joined the euro too early, we were not ready. We knew we were not ready. We knew it would be an extreme expense for the population, for the government. However, we felt, and in that there is huge consensus in Portugal, that we could not be outside the main core of building the European Union. We needed to make the effort to be in this group, come what may. And it did come, and it was indeed quite difficult. In some cases we had a 30% drop in the standard of life, but as yet we don't see any problem in our political body or body in terms of voting. So I would just like to say that it is important to stress the need not to obfuscate the meaning of sovereignty, because now it is used frequently by political forces who, in fact, they favor solutions that would walk us back to times prior to the current crisis. These are times that now look sunny, but that cannot be retrieved. Society has moved on, the problems have moved on, the crisis has moved on, and we should not be lured in the seduction of false solutions. And many times when we invoke sovereignty, we mean to convince part of the electors to go for this kind of solutions. The European Union has a solid, legal, voluntary entered basis. This is what needs to be worked on and adapted to present and future challenges. I know, and we know, and we have debated about being too rigid, unyielding, sometimes fighting yesterday's war and not today's problems. But we need, as 27 states, to work on that and make it work. Because just as Churchill is often quoted as there was no better solution than democracy with all its flaws, it's the same with the European Union. A country like Portugal does not even flirt with the idea that it could be outside of the European Union. It would have really extreme difficulty in finding out what to do. So in this sense, we would say that we have one big main task or challenge, which is to create stability. Okay? We in Portugal, we believe that the real key to stability in the Eurozone lies in the economic and social convergence between the economies of the different states and within the states with different regions. It is of the utmost importance that the periphery catches up to the highest standards of the center. And this, of course, requires efforts at the national level and at the European level. So we need, in our view, to consolidate the European and the Economic and Monetary Union. We need to finish the banking union. And this is where we think that the debate should focus more on the content of the reforms than start tinkering with institutional questions. So I would say that we feel that the most important second institutional challenge would be to avoid institutional challenge. Avoid institutional morass. Questions need to be solved, solutions found, everybody knows within the present framework. So we, the Portuguese government, thinks that we need to keep our eyes on the ball and no distraction from essentials. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyway, that's just all.
Well, let's see. Well, this element of communication works now, so I will use the academic privilege to identify and maybe expand problems, not offering any solutions. Well, firstly, what are the three major institutional challenges to the European Union today? I would say the first one is the crisis of meritocracy, or the crisis of public trust in meritocracy. It was formulated famously after the Brexit referendum by one British politician saying the people are fed up by experts, telling them what's right and how they can predict things. The economic crisis of 2008, for instance, strongly legitimized the expert-driven governance of things. And of course, it's a general problem, the crisis of meritocracy in every level of governance. However, the EU crisis is strengthened by the fact that simply the meritocracy, the ruling by experts, was the core principle and the core message of European integration since establishment. Regardless any debates about politicization of the European institutions, of the Commission, etc., the general message the European institutions sent to member states, well, maybe we are not the most funny people, most charismatic people, there are exceptions of course, but we know how things are done. We are not corrupted, we are highly skilled, we know so many languages you don't even know those languages exist in Europe. We have those good schools, and we see the broad picture how it looks in Europe, so we know how to deal with things better. And this statement, because of meritocratic governance of Europe, is now in very deep crisis. We can say that the people in many countries are not just fed up by experts, but they are fed up with Brussels mandarins. And, well, I don't know how to get out of it, but it's a significant existential problem for key EU institutions, European Commission and agencies in particular, because there is very difficult to find any alternatives for charismatic politics at EU level, etc. You can see it at the domestic level in many areas, but not even growing at the level of EU. So first thing, European crisis of meritocracy. Number two, again quoting politicians before, the distinction of role of jobs between the national and European level. The national level, you have politics without policy, and on EU level emerging policy without politics. It's again a simplification, but especially, it seems that this distinction not just emerged, but somehow petrified on both European and domestic level. And what is the crisis element of it is the emerging frustration, especially at the national level. Well, we have politics in every EU country. We have politics with high octane numbers, but the frustration of local domestic political elites to deliver policy results create frustration at domestic level and may lead to a situation when the national level tries to simply not cooperate but destroy the level of European Union where the policy is made, but where, in their opinion, no real political debate exists. And again, if we've seen experience of last EP parliamentary elections, European parliamentary elections, with the Spitzenkandidaten idea, again the term which was not even translatable to national languages, we see that getting more politics to the European level is difficult and not particularly successful story. So again, the second challenge, the frustration, especially at national level, created by the full political games running on national level, but without being able to deliver and present real policy results to their electorates. And the third thing, communication. The mantra is the EU should communicate better with member states, with citizens, to explain what's happening there, what are the good consequences, bad consequences of European actions. I said in many conferences last month, and the communication was mentioned in every second speech. And again, I try to do devil advocate here. Of course, European Union has a communication problem. but maybe it's not that there is not sufficient communication. The problem is not that there is not sufficient communication between the EU level and the companies, business people, common people in the streets. Maybe this communication argument is a kind of fig leaf for more deeper structure problem of the EU. If you look in debates on EU reform 10 years ago, the mantra was institutions. Where EU had a problem, we should have better institutions, they will deliver better results. We had Lisbon Treaty, it produced some institutional change, even better institutions, optimistically speaking, but they did not deliver better governance automatically, and many EU countries say they delivered worse governance. So now we replace this panacea of better institutions by better communication. Will it work? I'm not absolutely sure, but I'm not sure. I think what the EU might need, and again I am stealing ideas from previous conference speaker, the communication in the EU, which will be maybe less polite and more open, more ready to open very unpleasant topics, and taken those arguments more seriously. Then we will have maybe less polite, less comfortable communication, but maybe communication delivering more efficient or realistic solutions. Again, there must be certain limits. There are certain no-go areas, but I think the space of the what is debatable at EU level must expand. So those three things: crisis of meritocracy, the frustration by domestic politics without policies, and the dubious or very fluid character of communication debate will be the third topic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
I will try and this ways. Thank you so much. The crisis of meritocracy, national politics, and policy differences in communication. So already we see some overlap with communication, and then Benjamin, yours is the last, but of course very important 3 points about the challenges.
Thank you very much. Let me pick up and start with the question of the crisis of meritocracy. I think I agree with you, but I wouldn't frame it that way. I think we're seeing in the last few years with the shocks, both domestic and foreign, that the EU has been confronted with, the limits of technocracy and the limits of bureaucratic-driven policies. And I'm not, I'm not criticizing here EU bureaucrats as populists would do. I think it's not a crisis of institutions or instruments. It's a crisis of political leadership. Because the challenges that the EU has been facing in the last few years cannot be dealt with neutral, value-free instruments. They demand strong political choices that are based on a certain idea of value, a certain idea of identity, a certain sense of direction. And these are all themes that, to a large extent, especially in Western Europe, the EU had been built to transcend, to overcome. Ideas of identity, ideas of border, ideas of power politics. If you look at the way France and Germany think about these issues, precisely the EU was built as a way to transcend these needs. And I think what the European Union and what the European continent is facing right now in this respect is a return of politics, a return of these issues at the forefront, and the challenge that our policymakers are facing is to make the case and prove that the European Union is the best layer, is the best framework to protect the citizens, to protect their identity, their culture, their borders, rather than deny it on the other hand. I will give not three solutions first, but I think the three main shocks that the EU has been facing in the last years. Obviously, the refugee crisis, for a few reasons. First, because as I said, it put back at the forefront these issues of identity and culture that we haven't been able, or at least some of our elites haven't been able to deal with, because it struck the limits of sovereignty and of the European sovereignty model. When you talk about transfer of sovereignty, transfer of competence at the EU level, whether it's for monetary control or for border control, the initial deal was not that nations would abandon their sovereignty in exchange of nothing. The idea was that would transfer the sovereignty at the European level. And I think the message that was sent with the lack of control and the lack of foresight by EU institutions of this crisis was that no one was in charge. I think that's, there's this institutional or sovereignty element, and obviously it has shown the divisions within Europe, especially between Western and Eastern Europeans, in the way they refer to national identities and minorities. Even though I wouldn't stress that point too much, it's often made. I think you see it very much in the differences between Western and Eastern political leaders in the way they deal with this refugee issue. Not so much when you look at public opinion polls. Unfortunately, I think if you had today in France, Germany, or in the UK, I mean, in the UK you had it already in a way, a referendum comparable to the one that Orban had in Hungary, with all the, the obvious limits of this referendum that we know, I think unfortunately you'd have results that would be quite close, maybe not as stark, but quite close. That's, I think, the first shock. The second shock is Russian aggression. And if you look at the way it started when the European Union was negotiating the DCFTA, the free trade agreement with Ukraine, which I think was a welcome step. On the European side, on the Brussels side, it was mostly seen through technocratic lens. It was an economic free trade agreement that was negotiated by well-meaning economic experts and was mostly looked at, the economic advantage and impact it could have for both Europeans and Ukrainians. Both in Ukraine and in Russia, it was seen as a political instrument. It was seen as a way to anchor Ukraine to the West and to Europe. For the Ukrainian population, it was a welcome step. For Russia, it was seen as a threat, as a security challenge. But what is striking is that Europeans were caught completely unaware of this challenge. They completely underestimated the political impact of this free trade agreement. And the third shock, obviously, is Trump and the United States. And the fact that we now have a president of the United States that is going back to a very zero-sum approach to power politics that sees the Europeans as free riders, as consumers of securities rather than partners, and that doesn't hesitate to use instruments that were formerly taboo, like trade tariffs or more pressure against Europeans to achieve his needs. And we are seeing with the withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear deal, the JCPOA, the limits of what the Europeans can actually achieve. And I live in the United States. I've lived there for a few years, and I think there's a major debate on both sides of the Atlantic over whether Donald Trump is an exception, an aberration, or if he's representative of a deeper trend within American politics, both domestic but also in the way America approaches the world. And I think it would be very imprudent for us Europeans to treat him as an aberration. I remember a few years ago you would hear Europeans say, well, Obama was not a transatlanticist, but we're going to wait him out and we're going to go back to normal with a very internationalist and pro-alliance as American presidency. And now you do have some who will have the same approach to Trump. He'll just be around for a couple more years, he's very unpopular, and afterwards everything will go back to normal. And I think, unfortunately, we're going back to a much more raw power politics kind of relations that Europe is not philosophically comfortable with, not only philosophically, but in terms of resources and needs, obviously, but even, it's also a change of mind frame beyond the institutions. So, to give, I think, three conclusions to on the institutional aspect, I think clearly we need to have a very robust awakening on defense and security matters, and not look at it through only the narrow institutional frame, PESCO versus NATO. It's mostly a question of investment, and I don't think the two are incompatible. We're seeing that Europe's periphery, in almost every single border country, is is becoming unstable or challenging, and that we can only count on ourselves. So I think that's the first aspect. Otherwise, the shocks on our periphery end up being domestic issues for us, and the refugee crisis is the first, obviously, the most blatant example of this. The second dimension, which is correlated, is border control and immigration. And as much as I strongly agree with the idea that we should link the budget to rule of law and be extremely tough on backlashes against rule of law in countries like Hungary, I think, on the other hand, and we're going to see this in the June EU summit, we probably have, and I say we as a French citizen, have to be more understanding of the approaches on immigration in these countries, because they're not a result of authoritarian trends. They're a result of a large majority of the population that feels that way. And the third challenge, the last one, I think, is just basically to come back to this issue of return of politics, is accept, I think you mentioned something about the fact that the scope of conversation, the scope of issues is expanded. I think that's clearly what happened in the United States with Trump putting back at the forefront of the debate issues that had been considered to be unacceptable in civilized conversation. I think liberal pro-Europeans have to accept to repoliticize the debate, not circumvent it through bureaucracy, but fight the fight at the political and democratic level much more.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, thank you. As expected, there are very wide-ranging issues and challenges we face. So the way I would want to do this is I will raise the issue of the rule of law, and I will try to combine that with some of the challenges that you mentioned, and I believe certain areas, like for instance Russian sanctions and aggressions, which are important. Also Trump, maybe to the next panel, which will discuss hybrid regime, unless we want a commissioner for Twitter that might solve the Trump and communication dilemma all in one. So the rule of law issue, just to introduce this, because this is obviously for me coming from Hungary, but also I think for the whole European Union, especially here in Central Eastern Europe, a very important issue. And the issue is basically, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, what should the EU do, if anything, if and when a country seems, like Hungary, like Poland, seems not to respect those basic European values or, let's say, laws or regulations, which in the Copenhagen criteria would be vital if a country wanted to join the European Union. And the way I would want to combine this question with the challenges is, you mentioned in different scenarios 3 challenges. So I would ask, is this a communication problem? Is this a problem that maybe there's a difference in how we communicate value, and if only the European Union could explain better what the problem is, that would solve it? Or second, is it a problem of politics? Is it just simply too little politics on the European level? This is basically a power political play and no communication is ever going to solve this? Or third, is it an institutional challenge? Is it a challenge that we lack the European institutions on how to deal with those? Now, I'm sure you will all say, well, it's a combination. But I will give you now the floor to try to answer that and maybe bring that in, and of course also to reflect, if you have, on anything the previous speaker said. Should the EU do anything, and how, about those countries with respect to the rule of law? Are you already volunteering to be the first, Ivo?
Well, I've been volunteered, I see. Yes.
That's Hungarian.
Yes. That's the problem if you ask for 1-minute answer for someone who is researching the problem for over a decade. I think the core of the European problem, of the European response or absence of response to rule of law respect in member states, is whether we actually frame the debate within values or within norms. Because we see at EU level, we have some defined values, and even there is academic political debate, but we have virtually no rules, no clear rules, how rule of law in member states should look like. There are many initiatives, collection of data, but they did not produce any rules. And if you look how the EU actually is dealing with such a problem, it feels very uneasy when it is asked to deal with a problem where the referential framework is based on values, not on rules. There is even intuitive institutional reaction to run for rules instead of values. Looking at Hungarian case of redoing the judicial system, where there is many problematic points from the perspective of values, if you look what the European Commission has chosen as the formal challenge was the age limit, the retirement age limit for judges, and the reason why was not it was so threatening for the integrity of the system. There were much worse things, but because we have EU directive limiting age discrimination, so there was a clear norm which we use as a referential value. So that's of course rather efficient in these particular things, but again it legitimizes the whole EU impact, because again it's like choosing, if you have a horrible menu and you choose some way how the you have menu which can poison you at a restaurant, and you would in the review criticize how the cutlery is assorted. Yeah, so that's a problem a bit. I have a positive one. My second comment is that there is one element which is underused of EU governance, which is the mutual recognition and mutual trust. So we're not talking of the vertical issue, the Brussels versus Warsaw, Brussels, Budapest, Brussels, whatever country, but we are talking Prague, Warsaw, Dublin, Warsaw, Paris, Warsaw. And there is even now running a case at the European Court of Justice, where actually the Irish court asked the European Court of Justice whether the quality of judiciary in Poland is sufficient, so that the Ireland must respect the obligation to respect arrest warrants issued by Poland. And that seems to be a much more efficient way how to make countries improve its rule of law. Because if they started this horizontal communication and horizontal cooperation, their system can be crippled, both governmental and economic governance system can be crippled much more than by ugly letters sent from Brussels. So I think if there is a space which we should focus on is this issue of the horizontal communication and horizontal cooperation between the EU states based on mutual trust and mutual recognition of administrative and judicial decisions issued not by EU institutions but by in the everyday business of national ministries, agencies, courts, or tax authorities. That would be.
Thank you. Who would like to be next? Mel?
Okay, just very briefly. I would agree with what was said, because you have to bear in mind that for many years we had the EU as a city on a hill, and all the time we were improving on this city on a hill and trying to make it a most perfect political object, and that would of itself be a reason to belong to it. But given successive crises, we are more and more getting to fundamentals in the sense, do we need it or we don't? Is it useful or is it not? How can we make it work? And in that sense, we have to keep in mind that the EU is a union of national, sovereign, democratic states. And that is why, if it has any democracy to it, is the one that comes from there. And in that sense, I would agree very much that you don't have rules to force national states out of a certain number of values. And if you go to power argument, then it becomes much more difficult and rigid debate. So I would advocate that we should see these problems as political problems of a cultural nature, given the past of some countries that are having to deal with inherited stuff, so to speak, of years of, like my own country on the right, or other countries that have communist domination, and that it is required that both other member states and the EU institutions have both strategic and political patience, so to speak, as to make the issue become ingrained and solved horizontally, as was just said. Otherwise, it will become more crispated and will yield no progress.
If I can continue and stop me, because this is my topic and I have a tendency to go into details. On rule of law in Poland, I can share with you my personal frustration. I would be so happy if the case finishes. If we come to terms with Polish government, if they make compromise, the Commission will stand a little bit back and we will hopefully have some success at the end. Of course, the decision of the court, which Mr. Szosarczyk spoke about, well, it might be a game changer in the debate, because if the European Court of Justice will say in one country, in Poland, there are the courts taking decisions which cannot be recognized by the courts in other states, we have a structural problem in the whole Europe. And then, of course, I'm unhappy about that, but I have a strong argument for those who say, do not touch sovereign state. This is the internal matter of Poland. Well, it's not, because if the mutual recognition will stop working, then we have a problem. And not only with the European arrest warrant. I can tell you in 2 days, and I said it in the morning here, I will have a debate with Attorney General of US administration, Jeff Sessions. I want United States to agree on reciprocal exchange of data in criminal procedures. And they say, but we want to have bilateral agreements with some member states because you only don't have good pupils in your classroom. And it is not concrete, but of course I can see which countries are seen from United States as problematic ones, where they do not want to exchange data because they do not trust them. So again, I have the burden to solve. And this is not only a Polish problem. And as for the constitutional systems which create the environment for respect of rule of law, well, in Europe we have 28 unique systems. It's not copy-paste. None of the state systems are equal. But what we say, if you have, what we say to Poland, if you have in your constitution the constitutional tribunal to decide on constitutionality of laws and decisions, you cannot ruin the court. You cannot paralyze it. You have to have this court fully functional, because this is part of the horizontal system where it has the crucial role. Once you have the Council on Judiciary, you cannot nominate only political representatives there. This is the court of judiciary. It must be fully independent. So you cannot rape it and do it to create it as a political platform. If you have decisions made in the past by the courts, then you cannot have this extraordinary appeal, which can go back to 1998, I think, and to take any of the cases and say, well, it's res judicata, but not in Poland. We will open it again and decide again in light of the new situation. And of course, I hear very well what they say. I am a Czech person. I am also frustrated when I see some unpunished criminal offenses, the people stealing in the past in the Czech Republic. But who can rely on Polish institutions to only focus on the financial criminality? Who can say it will never be used against political opponents? And for me, it's nothing too convincing when I see that for this extraordinary appeal, when they can open all cases, only ombudsman and the Minister of Justice will be authorized to open the cases in the country where Minister of Justice is at the same time the General Prosecutor. Just imagine if we do this in the Czech Republic. So these are uneasy things to explain to the general public, but we have to try better, and of course we have to try to get to some conclusion and to some compromises with the Polish government, because for the Czech Republic this political situation in Poland is not good. We spoke about the Visegrad. We need this region to be stabilized, to be predictable, and not to have such judicial revolution, which also the judicial Czech elites said, this is incredible, you have to come back to civilized Europe. I told you I'll be long and passionate, and one more thing on communication. I agree, we need to be more courageous, to use the right names on the right things. I try to do that. I sometimes go beyond the lines. After the attacks against women in Köln, I said in the United States that the European Union is not a self-service with women for men coming to Europe. There was a big reaction, but I think that the people expect from the politicians to be more clear also who we are, what are our preferences and who we work for. I think that there is not enough honesty and openness and enough courage in politics.
And then after you answer this question, I will open the floor for the audience questions, so prepare your questions for the members.
Quickly, try speaking sometimes, that just works. Okay. No? No? Okay. So my can you hear me now? No. No. Why do you say? They know what you want to say, so.
Being censured. No, very quickly, I agree with the ambassador that we do have to take into account the different political, historical, cultural experiences, and we have to stay calm. We need to show that the European Union is not unraveling because you have certain measures that are taken in certain countries. That doesn't mean we don't have to react, but there is sometimes a tendency that I think is also reinforced by maybe by social media and the very short-term aspect of our conversation and debate to dramatize and overreact certain events. I think what's key, though, obviously because the European Union is an organization of liberal democracies, is to make we can't accept different values, we can't accept different political choices as long as clearly the game is still open and there's a playing field that makes sure that there's an opposition, a civil society, and an open conversation. And I think the distinction between values and norms, the values and rules that you made is key. And sometimes when I talk to people in Hungary and Poland, I think they have the impression that the European Union, beyond meddling in the institutional framework of these countries, is also trying to overreach in terms of values, whether that means social values, whether that means the questions of immigration. So coming back to the point that I made earlier, I do think it's important to stay extremely firm when it comes to push back against the rule of law, against balance of power, and use the budget and the structural funds, and also show the hypocrisy of certain of these countries that are very happy to be major recipients of structural funds, and at the same time to use the EU as a scapegoat in their political conversation, but at the same time show more flexibility when it comes to the political choices that are the consequences of the open debates there. And once again, on refugees, we're going to have this conversation in June, and this is where we should probably show I think more flexibility on the quota issue. So I think even when we reach out to the public opinions in Hungary and Poland, I think it's very important that we manage to distinguish these two issues, and they don't feel that they have to support Orban, because otherwise waves of migrants are going to come to Hungary.
I feel
personally feel that one has to be extremely careful with this connection between money and politics, so to speak. Because everybody's a taxpayer in Europe, right? The 40 million Poles are also paying tax. So this is an argument that is very easily, or can be very easily swayed. I hear that there are now proposals from the Commission as to the next multi-annual framework, that there would be on a project basis that monies could or could not be assessed according to certain prerequisites. That is of course different, but Europe lives off taxpayer money. And in that sense, it plays straight into the sovereignty argument. Even though it's by a side way that we are paying, so why our views, etc. And then majority voting, and that can be really used in internal debates where people already feel somewhat ambiguous towards these more, say, cosmopolitan, quote-unquote, values. Because there is also a problem with values. You can say core values, and then you say the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary. But in more affluent societies, we are seeing now values, the way that the value of equality and non-discrimination is being applied, like to same-sex marriage, etc., is provoking sometimes huge backlash in some countries that are not prepared to deal with that. And it is difficult to make this argument. So maybe also this can be somewhat considered in developing these models that allow or not allow for money being used.
So the issue is communications, politics, and institutions. Just I thought. Question, please.
Thank you, Philip Long for Res Publica. Particularly to the point the Portuguese ambassador ended on, I think she's absolutely right. What we are in the middle of is values conflict and values division. If you track values, values are increasingly divided in so-called liberal societies, and they are polarizing further. I'm on the panel shortly, I'll talk about it, but essentially we are in post-liberal times, and liberal values no longer command majority assent, because they don't serve the majority, they serve people at the very top of the economic scale and people at the very top of the social scale. That's broadly the debate. So what then is interesting is, what do you do in Europe where values are dividing? Because what happens when values are dividing, I think that's what's happened in Poland, is those who don't share the cosmopolitan value set see all the institutions populated by people with that common value set. So the point about Montesquieu is this division of the executive branch doesn't work. They're all the same, right? It's a failure, the system, and actually what you need is actually much more of a British system that manages to blend both hierarchy and demos in a different sort of way. But the point is, and again, just to refer, is when you have countries with strong Christian context and Christian values, and when you have the Commission seeing to, I'm not saying this is a fair perception, to enforce something like same-sex marriage, to enforce something like transgender, to enforce essentially things that majorities view as genuinely abhorrent or deeply questionable, and then to enforce it, then you have values conflict. And that is something that Europe must avoid. And what we need then is liberalism recognising that there are other forms of legitimate values besides liberalism. And the only choice isn't, liberalism isn't the only ideological option that can govern Europe. There are other ideologies that aren't necessarily fascist, that aren't necessarily totalitarianism. Both socialism and conservatism are not liberal, that also have to be let into the pantheon of legitimate ways to govern. Now the difficulty, of course, for the Commission is given that context, and given that actually Europe has been ruled from a hegemony of liberal values, how do we manage that division? And if they don't, this will only increase the populist vote.
But is Europe being ruled by a liberal elite that wants to force transgender on everyone?
Europe, if that's exactly, keep doing that, and populist vote will keep going up.
I do all those highly sensitive agendas.
Yes.
So I think I'm qualified to tell you one thing. EU enforces non-discrimination, full stop. So I am not imposing anything on the member states to introduce sex marriages or anything around transgender. No discrimination, that's my baseline.
They see it through the European Court, though, right? They don't make these discriminations in terms of your institutional responsibilities. That's the point. They see it as a kind of a vast, absent agenda enforcing parameters upon them. That's why they don't have reform.
I think it requires a lot of demitization, because I am happy I am not forced to do this policy out of hysteria and pushing the member state to things which I am absolutely sure they will not take them. And I can give you an example. I am promoting the so-called Istanbul Convention, which is the convention against violence against women and children, especially domestic violence. And in some Eastern countries, including the Czech Republic, in the countries where we have Slavonic language, we do not differentiate between the words sex and gender. And the problem is here, that in fact sex means that it is the natural division of roles. You are a man, I am a woman, and we simply look differently and work in some situations. And gender is a social concept or construct. And in some countries, the Istanbul Convention is very criticized by Orthodox Church and Catholic Church on the basis of this convention is introducing the third gender, or is pushing us for sex marriages. And it's not true, but it flies. Nobody read it, but it flies so well because the people identify EU with exactly what you mentioned. So I only take this message that I have from, I should invest more time in convincing people that the EU, that it's the past, when the EU was pushing other countries to change the basic concepts. For instance, in gender policy, the famous quota. I am against quotas, and I'm against positive discrimination. So I changed the directive into gender neutral directive, but still it works. It lives its own life, so we have to explain better and better. But you touched upon the national instincts, which we have to work better with. And we also said it, I think, that we have some reactions connected very tightly with the identity matters. And in the matters of identity, I think we cannot make any compromises. It's not fiscal policy, or it's not money, it's not economy. Here we feel it somehow. And I agree that if something is pushed from the side of the Commission or Union, it's very problematic. And I had very tough debate with one of my colleagues, I will not name her. I tried to explain why the Czech people are so much against the migration quota. And I said in the past we took hundreds of thousands of people from West Balkan, but it was voluntary decision. It was a responsible voluntary decision. The state offered the place for the people because the state was sure that the state will ensure security for the people and integration of the people. But in this new migration situation, not all the states can guarantee that. And by imposing the concrete quota of people to take, this is very problematic. And I try to explain to my colleague also what does it mean to live for decades in homocultural or monocultural society. And she told me, but one day you have to start changing that. And I said to her, if we decide, we will change it, but it's not you who will tell us what to do. And I have myself these instincts, and I think that it will be very important when the Western Europe will start using these Eastern instincts. Because I think also in relation to Russian aggression, that's the same thing. I'm sure that we have much more to say about how Russian aggression can look like in the future and how far it can go. And my first memory in my life was the Russian tank in my street. So we are ready. We are ready to provide this to Europe, but also Western Europe has to listen to us, and we should also listen Western Europe in many other things.
Anyone else would like to comment on that real briefly, because I do want to go on to other questions, but I think it's important to.
Just very quickly to react to what Philip said. I agree with 50% of what you said. I do think, however, that what you are being the mirror image of what you criticize at the Brussels level, which is that you criticize an overreach in both institutions and in social values. But I think it's very risky to conflate the two and say, well, this is part of their identity, this is part of their sovereignty, and we should be more tolerant of this, because this is exactly what they're trying to get away with. They say, you know, the European Union is imposing values that go against our culture and the majority of our population, whether it's identity or social issues, and there I agree with you. But to make sure that they're right when it comes to what the majority of the population believes, then you need to have an open debate, and you need to have an opposition that could work. You need to have a civil society, checks and balances. You know, so this is where I think it's extremely important to be very strict on the institution. The institutions are not values; they're neutral. But then afterwards, yeah, be more tolerant indeed of the diversity of opinions and systems that can, you know, be a consequence of these institutions.
Well, I don't want really to steal time for questions, but I will do. I'm a lawyer, so I still see this division between values and norms. You actually don't enforce values, you enforce norms. You can promote values. Should that work? Yes, okay. So one thing which is kind of, I think the harshest thing for Commission today is to translate the values jargon into enforceable norms and to decide how to do it, which one and which not. And actually, it might be a devil advocate from the new member state, for new member state. We are at present rather frustrated by some norms produced by the EU level, or norms which might be produced. But maybe we, before, in previous 10 years, invested too much time in debate on how to influence norms, and underestimated all influence or effort to influence debate on the values in the EU level, saying, okay, they're just some boring values, yes, let's look at the real norms on the size of bananas, or the detail of the quotas in the companies. But maybe one thing we should do more, if it's possible in this context, to really influence not the normative value, norms, but the debate about which values European Union really respects or promotes, and how the Central European imprint in those values should look like, if it doesn't have to. Thank you.
Thank you. You had one question there?
I would like to return to the issues which were alluded to by Benjamin Haller, the foreign policy. Because after all, it is still valid, this sort of saying that European Union is an economic giant and political dwarf. European Union picks out, sort of, cherry picking, you know, selecting some issues in which European Union is involved. But still, European Union is simply lacking certain weight on the international arena. And to some extent, what this famous attributed to Kissinger saying, what is the telephone number I can phone to find out what is the European Union policy on certain issues, is the answer is, well, yes, this is the telephone of Margherini. But the problem is that if you dial this number, the answering machine tells you for German policy dial 1, for French policy dial 2. This is the problem. And also there is a problem of decision making. After all, when there was a crisis in 2008 between Russia and Georgia, when the Russian tanks were on the outskirts of Tbilisi, President Sarkozy, that France was chairing the European Union, went to Moscow, and the only thing he could do is to sign an agreement with Putin as the President of France, not as a representative of European Union. So I think that, you know, we desperately need, you know, to somehow move forward in forming foreign and defense policy and doing something more, because PESCO, actually, what as it was formed now, is just a decoration. It's another version of CSDP. If everybody belongs to PESCO, then PESCO is nothing. The whole essence of PESCO is somehow diluted. So I think my point is, and this is the question, do you think that this is important also issue to be raised in the European Union? Maybe not as important as present-day sort of alarming issues like migration, but still an important issue, because after all, besides everything, there is still a very open question. What is the real meaning of famous Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty? Article in which all countries are obliged to come up with assistance if a country is under attack. How far this assistance will go? What is the real meaning of that? So I think that the issue of foreign relations, although the European Union made tremendous progress, but it's still worth considering.
Thank you. Would like to pick that up? Let's start there then, and then.
Thank you. I completely agree with what you said. And quickly, if you look at the glass half full, yes, most countries are increasing the defense spending. I think they're realizing that we don't have a choice, and the various security shocks of the last few years have reawakened us. And I think one optimistic point is you do see a convergence in the strategic cultures of most countries in the European Union. You have Estonian and German troops in the Sahel alongside the French fighting terrorism, and at the same time you have most Western Europeans who are in the Baltic states and Poland in the NATO's European Reassurance Initiative. So in the sense of threat, not necessarily in the hierarchy, but at least in the sense of threats and the different challenges, there's a convergence. However, if you look at the glass half empty, it's not even just a question of the EU as an institution being weak. It's weak because its member states are weak. And because even the strongest military powers within the European Union don't have the capacity today to really shape their strategic environment. I'll just give you one example, the Syrian crisis. Most of Europe's strategy on Syria has been to beg the United States to get involved and to try to find a political solution to the conflict, but for the United States, this has been either a humanitarian disaster far away, or maybe more strategic challenge with Russia and Iran reshaping the Middle East. But it hasn't been an existential crisis. For the EU, it has been an existential crisis with the wave of refugees, with the ISIS-inspired terrorist attacks, with the consequences they had with the rise of populism all over Europe. This was really, in our periphery, an existential challenge for the EU, but no country, either on its own or even taken together, could come up with a solution, with a strategic solution to such a challenge. So, if we decide changes, in any case, this is, I think, a generational challenge to completely change our mindset on the issues. Thank you.
Yes, just shortly, I think that it's quite obvious from several policy papers which this commission published that we want to be and must be much stronger in foreign policy and in defense policy. And by the way, it's very well reflected in the budget, which has been now proposed, with giving more money on these matters, and expecting that maybe the member state will push on more money for that. I think that Federica Mogherini is doing an excellent job. She is underestimated in many debates. I hear it. I think it's quite unfair, because just imagine and remember all the crises we went through, and she always was very proactive and constructive voice, having the influence, positive influence on the development of the matters. The EU speaks the same language. When she speaks to Mr. Trump and then Macron and Merkel and others, I think they tell him the same things. Now in trade policy, it's quite obvious that this is the common quick action, where there is no doubt that we want the same thing and speak the same language. And she, unfortunately, doesn't always have a strong backing from some of the member states, where they do not speak the same language in foreign policy. For instance, Czech Republic.
I saw 3 questions, so we will just have them real short because we have 15 minutes for the panel. So you, second and third.
Thank you. You just mentioned Mogherini's name. I'm not sure I share your position 98% of the time, and this is not one. Maybe it's a question of communications or so, and there is one thing that where I wanted to ask. We talk about Trump, we talk about Russia, but I haven't heard anything here about China, or not enough. China and India, and overall European position to intellectual property, theft, competition, unfair competition, and U.S. is now in war with China commercially and all that. Mogherini may be good, you know her, I don't. But she has to build a consensus. It's up to her to build a support from those countries. Okay, her power comes from support of other countries, and I don't see her in the news very often. I don't see her doing things and making herself visible, namely versus China, India, and so on.
Thank you. Second question.
Charles Ross, European Anti-Corruption Center. I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists for taking the time to address these tough questions. In looking at the concept of an institutional response of the European Union and also the United States towards the Russian aggression in Ukraine, occupation of Crimea, and occupation of the large part of Donbass, how would you address or attempt to address the problems that, in fact, there is a large criminal element, covert funding, which, in fact, is paying for this war, which is so close to us, we can drive there overnight. It is a difficult problem for the European Union, a difficult problem for the United States and all of the Western governments. This is a critical time. How would you approach finding a better unified Western response? I know it's tough. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And third question.
Ankavan from the Czech Republic. I would like to refer to something which Commissioner Jourova mentioned this morning, and that is the recent withdrawal of President Trump from the JCPOA, which, after all, is an agreement signed by 3 leading EU countries. It's an agreement where everybody agrees that neither EU country nor Iran has violated the agreement. So with respect to rule of law, respect to signed contracts and its ability to respect it, my question is, what can the EU do in response in order not to lose or undermine its own weight, not to undermine its perception of rule of law, and lastly, paradoxically, as Russia was mentioned here a few minutes ago, in this particular instance, we find ourselves, in terms of law, on the side, or rather, find ourselves in a situation where we can share a similar point with Russia and China, rather than with our main political ally, the United States. What should be, therefore, the most adequate response of the EU, both politically but also legally, because it is, after all, a legal agreement beside economic interests of European firms. Thank you.
Thank you for these questions, and your panelists should each have, if you wish, 2 minutes to respond to any or all the questions and also conclude.
Yeah, so I will be quick, and first, Mr. Kavan, well, what shall we do on Iran agreement? Well, to keep it alive, to keep Iranians in, to protect the financial interests of or economic interests of the European banks and businesses, to uphold the interests of all Europeans to be secure. And as for the economic backing, we are considering several very concrete ways, including possible engagement of European Investment Bank, which would guarantee the financial transactions going there. Because we have to get used to the situation to continue without the United States. That's the reality. And but to keep going, because for us the agreement is absolutely vital. On Russia, how to find the common approach, I think it's connected with China. Of course, it's now a very chaotic situation, because our strongest traditional, over decades, reliable, strategic partner, United States, is doing unpredictable things, which in many cases we could read them as hostile towards the EU. We don't understand many of those things, but we have to react on them, and it means that it, in fact, pushes us to make alignments or alliances with China and Russia, mainly or only in some economic areas. With Russia, of course, it's very problematic because sanctions are ongoing, but we have areas where we can and we should cooperate, not to cut all the lines, because nobody wants to have absolutely open and direct confrontations. With China, we have a strategy which comprises different portfolios, including mine. So, for instance, I follow my interest of stopping import of dangerous products from China on European market. I am pushing Alibaba to have a full headquarters in Brussels so that they can be exposed to sanctions for also copyright problems. And this is covered by several commissioners. Although it is not one unique strategy which we will publish, we go in the same direction to keep China as the strong economic partner. With Russia, to do the same thing where possible and where it's not contradicting our sanctioning approach.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to react to the questions? So I will then I will have a very short concluding question to you, because we started by saying this will focus on institutions, and we did, but very often and very fast communications questions came up, and questions about values came up, and you specifically mentioned that we should not get into institutional, we should not necessarily look for institutional solutions. So I would be interested in very short learning the opinion of others, or on a scale of 1 to 10, just to make it easier, 10 being European institutions are perfect, and 1 being, well, we should scrap the whole institutional framework. How important is it? How should we approach institutions, or is the whole institutional question now becoming secondary to the questions you mentioned, mainly communications and values? And that is my concluding question.
I will not give numbers, but I think that the debate showed that we are perfect at this stage. We don't need to change the institutions. We need to work on contents, how to improve communication, how to improve this, how to make it more recognizing the specificities of some member states that need to develop this or that, so that we are not about to have any major institutional initiative, but to go deeper, solve the questions, or try to find bridges between the questions and put people to work on a moment that everybody is very stressed with huge challenges. And of course, we will not promote the institution that will give one foreign policy and one defense policy to the Union. That is in the past.
Sure. Every organization, every country could improve its institutions, that's for sure. It's never optimal. But yeah, I do agree that the priority is politics, it's leadership, it's content. I am a little skeptical about the terms communication because I often hear it both in Brussels and in Washington. If only people knew better who we were and what we did, and it always implies a sort of false consciousness of voters who, are not smart enough, and not informed enough, and sometimes you do have to come to terms with the fact that our policies fail. That doesn't question the whole project, but if you look at the refugee issue, it was a major failure of foresight in border control. And if you look at the JCPOA, I think unfortunately our leverage and margins are extremely limited because of our political weakness with the United States. We could ensure investments, European investments in Iran, but if a bank like BNP Paribas that was fined $9 billion by the United States for circumventing embargoes on Iran and Sudan and Cuba could face the same kind of fine, the EU is not going to insure it, it's not going to save it, and unfortunately, I wish I'm wrong, but I don't think there's much we can do. We tried to convince Washington to exempt European investment from sanctions, but apparently it's definitely not the objective of the United States, U.S. administration right now. So this should be, once again, a generational wake-up call. Maybe in the short term there's not much we can do, but to make sure that these kind of situations don't happen again in the future. Thank you.
Well, I see that your request for rating 1 to 10 was more or less ignored. I will try to be obliged. So if the question was whether institutions are doing their job properly, I would say 5.5. They are keeping the business of EU more or less ongoing. In the leadership, something is happening regardless that the problem of legitimacy of this was happening, etc. Okay, 6.5. Regarding the attention we should give to the European institutions in the complex of whole debate of European integration, communication, values, leadership, I would say number 3. I think that institutions are settled, and more attention should be given not on polishing the institutional design of the EU, but putting more content and the best people in those institutions.
And I am biased, so I will say 7. Okay?
You could have given 10. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for this panel. We touched on institutions, communications, values, and conflicts of values. Thank you so much for covering this very broad topic in a very focused way. Thank you. We will now, thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. And it's my honor to welcome here Lady Mayor of Prague, Adriana Knačová, and then I always confuse it, so I will stick with Mr. Ambassador. I don't know if you really, Your Excellence. So, Mr. Ambassador of France, Monsieur Gallagher, and last but not least, Philip Blond from the independent non-partisan think tank, Respublica, which is one of the most influential think tanks in Great Britain. As most of you followed, the debate before was focusing on institution of the European Union. So maybe we will move it a little bit to the future, but also, since we have a mayor here, to the citizens. So what is the Europe we are all creating, and how Europe should look within, let's say, horizon we can all focus on in 10, 15, 20 years. And of course, it's also interesting we can have a very unique Czech position, French position, and then still it would be very interesting to hear the opinion about the development of the project of the European Union from a representative from the United Kingdom. So, anyone who would like to start? So, where are we now? What's the project? But how do you see EU? And let's focus on normal people. Like, it's at the end, not only, as was said before, one of the most powerful political organizations.
Well, thank you for, is this working? Yes? Okay. Thank you very much for having me. I know it's a difficult time, wedged between the siesta and tea time, so I'll try my best. Where are we now? I would say the short answer is we're in a situation where we have to act, and we have to act quickly. I think that the dissatisfaction with the EU, as evidenced perhaps with the results of the referendum in Great Britain, has perhaps never been so high among citizens. So this needs obviously to be repaired. Point one. Point two, never, I think, have the challenges been so great. What is new, I would say, in strategic terms, is that now the EU has grown up, now the EU has enemies. This was not the case before. Before, the EU was most generally perceived with a kind of benign contempt or benign neglect, if you want. Now we have enemies. We have authoritarian powers in some parts of our continent whose main strategy is premised on the idea that they should achieve the vision inside the EU. Moreover, the challenges, of course, whether it be trade or proliferation or the situation in the Middle East, migration, etc., have never, to that extent, called for a joint response. So never has been the dissatisfaction higher, never have been the challenges that important. Therefore, I think the logical conclusion is that we're in need of action, and we are in need of quick action.
Yeah, thank you. I've been very struck so far by this conference, and my compliments to the organisers for creating platforms where you can genuinely raise the issues. And I think where the panel ended, the last one on the question of values, is exactly where the issues are. Brexit is really the strongest indication yet of what I have called a post-liberal move in politics. About 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Red Tory, where I said that liberalism, as the governing philosophy of the West, has failed and will continue to fail, and that we need to replace liberalism or qualify liberalism in order to meet the crises that liberalism has created. And I think you all broadly know what those are. Economically, it's economic insecurity for those in the West. Liberalism, pace globalization, we've seen wage stagnancies, we've seen the share of capital going to labour, either stagnant or falling. And the areas of stagnancy are rising into the middle class, and the areas that are falling are the working class. Moreover, what we've seen on liberalism's watch is just unprecedented monopolisation of the economy, unprecedented economic concentration, a fall in the number of participants in each market, a fall in new entries to that market, and a capture, in essence, an oligarchical capture of far too much of our economic settlement, all done on liberalism's watch, all, especially the tech firms, without any real new innovations in competition or anything else. And what, in essence, liberalism has produced economically is what is insecurity. One of the dominant themes, and I worked with the Christian Democrats in the Netherlands some 5 years ago, was insecurity. I poll all across Europe, it's insecurity. That's economic insecurity which liberalism has created in the West, not in the East, of course, is one of the key factors behind Brexit. But far more important is the values question. In Brexit, those who voted to leave knew that they were committing a form of economic self-harm. And they said, in spite of this economic self-harm, I still want to leave because Europe threatens our values. Europe is viewed as an offshore liberal aristocracy that enforces foreign value sets against our small c social conservatism. And I thought the Commissioner earlier spoke extremely well. But nonetheless, Europe, which understands not just the Commission, but the whole architecture, including the Court of Human Rights, will enforce any new innovation in matters of sex and gender against received perceptions of what ought to be the case. And in Britain, at least, what was threatened, or felt threatened, was the idea of national identity and national sovereignty. But more importantly, if economic liberalism has failed, so too has social liberalism. And what's the dominant trend associated with social liberalism for European populations? Unrestricted migration. Unrestricted migration that is indifferent to the values of migrants. So people fear, and in some cases rightly, the importation of hostile minorities. They fear, although it has to be kept tacit, they fear the Islamicization of Europe. I'm very struck in Welbeck's novel, Submission. The central author says, essentially, Europe wants to dissolve nation states. The project of Europe is to strip away nation states and produce a liberal, valueless consumer. And I think I'm not saying Welbeck's accurate about Europe, but in capturing the ideological flow, I think he is. So they're the elements that led to Brexit. Now, once you have a values-led disjuncture, you pretty much set, because values are among the most difficult things to change in politics. And now the Conservative Party, 70% of those who voted for the Conservative Party are for Leave. So we've welded Leave agenda to the Conservative Party through Brexit. And Brexit has changed value perceptions in British politics, and people no longer vote for economic interest, they vote for perceived value interest. Now this hasn't just happened in Britain. Roughly in all of the countries in the European Union, somewhere between 1/3 to 40% of people are likely to vote for this type of approach. So some instances like Hungary and Poland are instances of people who no longer buy the governing value set of Europe. And I was at a PIS, Law and Justice conference 2 days ago, where they kindly invited me to speak. And they were the first centre-right party I've ever worked with or spoken at, who said explicitly, we are against both social liberalism and economic liberalism. And they are also the most educated party, contra views that I've ever worked with. Everyone's a professor, I've got PhDs, they've got double appointments. And what is very lucid, if you look at what the Polish Prime Minister said, is we don't want an oligarchical outcome from the type of capitalism we have. We want a distributed, quasi-Catholic outcome that empowers small businesses and uses capital to generate prosperity and generate assets. Now, the point I want to make here is that, in my view, these forces will only increase. The type of capitalism we have isn't going to change unless there's radical change in our architecture. It was fascinating, again, the panel on migration, as to how far we are from, in any sense, solving that, or in any sense coming up with something that can remove all these young men from the streets of Italian towns and restore something like social security. So populism, in this sense, isn't something necessarily racist, though it can be, or sectarian, though it can be. It's actually something that has genuine roots in the paradigms of governance. And just to end the initial claim or discussion, my basic thesis is that liberalism cannot be the governing philosophy of Europe. Because if liberalism is first philosophy, if liberalism comes first, totalitarianism comes second. Now, by that I mean that at base, liberal philosophy is nothing other than untrammeled will for the individual. Following Marx and Rousseau, what it then does is take that and blend it into a general will that seeks to enforce its will anywhere and produces the phenomenon that we now see of what I would call illiberal liberalism. Essentially, be like me, or else you don't enter the canon of rational civic actors. And so what I think is needed in order to preserve Europe, and you might be surprised by this, I'm a conservative who voted to remain, I want the European Union to succeed, and I want it to flourish. But what it has to do is expand the debate about its ruling values away from liberalism. Christians, Catholics, those who believe Europe has, apart from a liberal foundation, a Christian foundation, essentially feel excluded from that value set. And as Ivo, I think, said earlier, what we need is a broader account of the values that we deem acceptable. And then we can stop having the idea that only liberalism should govern. And then I think Europe might survive. But if we persist with a narrow account of what's legitimate, the 30 and 40% of populations that will vote to resist it will only grow.
Good afternoon. Sorry to speak after you.
Sorry.
My fault. My fault. Okay, so I'm not going to make a philosophical thinking around about what should Europe be or not, because I can watch it from the perspective of a city and a member of the regional community of regions, which is in the European Union in Brussels, as a representative of Prague. I've always, asked myself a question in the last upcoming, or the past weeks, why we are so unsatisfied constantly. This is the question what we are. I don't understand, especially not in our environment. We are living in a wealthy environment. We've never had such a wealth ever, but still we are still unsatisfied. So what is lacking in our existence to make us satisfied finally after all this struggle we had in the past century? I can't, and I was constantly putting this question to myself, and honestly, I cannot find an answer, because it's so difficult. It's, as it was said, it's a set of values what we apparently forgot to execute to ourselves, and for the environment, the government. It is apparent that the people don't perceive it as that the government and the European Union is somehow built up with some values, because we are constantly arguing with each other. And if the members of the European Union are constantly arguing and questioning those values, so how it should be understandable for the citizens then. And especially for those who really they are not interested in politics. For example, people living in big cities. And the difference between the so-called big politics and the local politics is that the local politics is not that much influenced by the high politics, because we actually don't care whether this is right or left. The fact is, I need that it's functioning. It's functioning for the good of the people here in the city. And to be honest, I'm not looking at it from the point of view whether it was a decision from a person from the, I don't know, from the blue party or the red party. At the end of the day, my success is if it's done. And I think, we have to start to look from this perspective also to the European Union. It has to be done, whatever it is. Not to talk that much. Just remember what kind of values were at the beginning of the establishing of this family. That's in the beginning. Because I perceived it as a family of countries which want to perceive freedom, economic wealth, and all these they want for their citizens. And somehow this attempt is lost on the way. So we have to get back to the values, where we are coming from, why we established the European Union, and try to remember what they represented, those values. Because, as I said in the beginning in the morning, if we will be not able to explain to our citizens what are the values, is what we are stand for, somebody else is going to do it. And we will be very surprised, and we will not like it.
I would like to thank all our speakers for the intro. And it seems that what we have in Europe is a sort of depression out of all the happiness and wealth we have. So before we will give the floor to you, let me just sort of wrap it up. And I would like to expand on what are the actions we should take as the EU. And of course, values, it seems to be the word of today. So what are the values? What is maybe the lack of the value in Europe? I like that. Let's talk about Europe, maybe let's not only focus on the European Union. And of course, what also was raised by Lady Mayor is people are not really interested in politics. And frankly, this is a very special crowd. Everyone here is interested in politics, so but we are maybe not the representative of the general society. So how to also spread the interest, and what are the goals, what we should have. I remember back in 2014 when there were polls done for the city of Prague, but the citizen wanted Prague. The response was, we want better quality of life. No one really knew what this was. And I guess we all want better EU, but what is it? So in this, let's get to the action. What should we do in Europe to preserve either EU or our values? And of course the floor is for yourselves, unless some of the speakers would like to. Maybe we can take more questions, like let's take 3 questions.
Okay, Ivo Kaplan. I think the European values are clear. Solidarity, subsidiarity, respect to human dignity, and rule of law. It's very simple. It's from David Locke. So, so why we are, not me, I'm happy, but many people are all the time questioning what we should do. Because they are listening from TV, they are reading newspapers, what is going wrong. And they are not watching around them what is good. But 1 or 2 centuries ago, there was a patriarch, there was the father of the family, and he explained to everybody what is good and what they should do and what they must do. And then if you have this community of these patriarchs, you have a happy society. And this it is clear, and it is very, very simple. But for sure, it was only for some 5% or 10% of society. Now we have this, as was said by Mr. Blond, period of liberalism, which is practically half a century in the...
Formulate a question.
Half a century governs the society. So we have now not more 3 generations, even 2 generation families below. Everyone is single, everyone is seeking the destiny of him. So how you want to make this big family of nations, like said Mrs. Spinach about it, we have to have. So how you could make it? You could make it through institutions, but you should speak there. Not only come with some instructions and then go back. We see President Macron's initiative from 26th of September last year. What is the response? Nobody is responsive. Only criticizing of Netherlands and these other 7 states. And where is the response? Germans, they are all the time something speaking, and nothing. So there is my question. What will be done on 19th of June this year, and what is the perspective of the UK and French and other 8 nations in the European initiative?
Charles Ross here, Kinetic Reference Center. I'd like to follow up on Ambassador Gallerad and Mayor Kernachkova's comments. There are urgent questions. In fact, history has its responsibilities, and those responsibilities are our shared responsibilities. In Europe, in America, the problems we face are surprisingly similar. So I would ask you, please, in the context of our debates today, what are those top issues that you feel need urgent response? Thank you.
Well, I think that you really refer to liberalism as one rigid, fairly well-defined sort of concept, which is obviously not true. Liberalism is sort of a whole range of various concepts ranging from Rawls to Chicago School. So within this spectrum, you can really find, a quite reasonable version of liberalism. But this is just a comment. But I think that really what the European values are boiling is that all countries which are members of the European Union declare that they will be following a certain political system, which is democracy, but not Greek-style democracy, where the majority decides everything, including the death penalty for Socrates, but liberal democracy. That means democracy which respects the rights of minorities, respects the rights and tolerates these minorities, creates certain political area where these minorities can function and can also challenge the authorities. And this is trouble with governments in Hungary, in Poland. And so how would you sort of comment on what I said?
Thank you. So maybe we start from right to left.
Okay, I'm not a philosopher. I'm only a diplomat. So I would tend to subscribe to what Kernachkova has said. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. So what we need to do really is to take some actions. And I would say along perhaps along 3 axes. I think one of the causes of this unease which has spread, and there I would agree with my neighbor, throughout all societies in member states of the EU, one of the sources of this unease, of this unbehagen, this malaise, is really that people have a feeling that their governments do not control what is happening, nor do they, the people, control their own lives. So what we are faced with, essentially, is a question of sovereignty. So I would propose that the first axis that we should be trying to take some action on is sovereignty. And there I would make a plea not to go into the perennial debate about whether EU sovereignty means less sovereignty for member states or whether it's the opposite. I didn't react to what someone said in the previous panel, but I think that what we need is clearly European sovereignty for the size of challenges that we are confronted with. We need a size that is compatible, that is a match to these challenges. So we need to be able to decide. If we do not decide ourselves, then others will decide for us. This is exactly what we are seeing now in a number of fields. Take, for instance, the digital industry, which decides what will happen with our data, for instance. What is the answer? The answer is not for our small, petty countries, small states, to take measures on their own. We can only achieve any measure of success if we act collectively. Now, this does not mean that we are doing away with national sovereignty. Actually, quite the opposite. For the EU to be strong, we need strong member states. For any form of European sovereignty to emerge, which I think is needed, we need strong national sovereignty. So, in my view, it's completely wrong to oppose one to the other. The two actually complement each other and are an extension of each other. So first thing, sovereignty as a way to deal with this feeling of having lost control over one's destiny, which is so prevalent. Second, I think we need more democracy. People are afraid. People are afraid to plead in favor of Europe. Europe, for many politicians, is a topic that is best avoided or best, not spoken about, avoided, or criticized. It's either or. And we should do the opposite. We should take on the opponents of Europe. We should go and confront our views with and not fear debate. Perhaps my view there is being shaped also by the results of the French elections, but because we were in a similar situation of this anxiety, of a racist, anti-European, call it what you like, sort of party, rising to levels that it seemed virtually impossible to defeat them. What the results of the elections have proven is that the reply is not to shy away from debate. The reply is to, the right response is to take them on. So more democracy. And there, I would only mention en passant this start of the citizens' consultations, which have been launched here in the Czech Republic by the Czech Prime Minister. I think it was last week or 10 days ago, which is something which is now spreading throughout the EU in all member states, and I think a very welcome development. And last, but certainly not least, we need more unity. We need more unity because our adversaries are trying to divide us. Because the results of the financial crisis of 2008, or the results of the migration crisis of 2015, or the results of the action of the financial markets is to encourage divergences among us. North-south, east-west, euro, non-euro, rich-poor, virtuous, non-virtuous, etc. We need to do away with this. So it means that, and someone also in the previous panel said that we should avoid a repetition of what happened in July 2015 when some countries were outvoted. We should find solutions. We should find solutions also in the field of migration that rest on solidarity and responsibility. But we should find solutions in a consensual way. I would perhaps stop it at that.
In response to the first question, I also very much enjoyed your reflections on the general malaise. Aldous Huxley in Brave New World said, in the future, we will only have sexual freedom. If you read the introduction to Brave New World, yeah. Well, in a way, one of the causes of our satisfaction is the governing ideology we have has essentially destroyed all communal and associative forms of institution and behaviour. So the logic of liberalism has repeated itself at the social level and produced mass atomisation. There's even a report today, for instance, that unprecedentedly the US birth rate has fallen for the second year in a row. And this consequence of destroying any associative behaviour, anything from trade unions to the extended family, which is a part of modernisation as well as a ground achievement of liberal philosophy, is that you're unable to mediate your desires with others. Your desires become ever more fantastical, and you're unable to bring your desires into conflict with reality, because it's precisely that reality that is denied. So one of the interesting ways to look at this is human status. So what we've done in the world is we've removed the possibility for human beings to feel good about themselves. So we've monopolised status. So in Britain, at a certain point, every young boy wanted to be David Beckham, right? This is not possible or indeed desirable. But what we've done is, because that's how status was viewed, is we centralised status. We stripped status from being the vicar's daughter, from being a good mechanic, from doing good work in your place, so people were unable to feel good about that. Now, if you think this doesn't matter, let me tell you an interesting thing. People who win Oscars live longer than people who are just nominated for Oscars. Status matters enormously for creatures like us. There's been some horrific experiments, and I think prison scientists who did it, but apparently they did some experiments where they denied alpha male status to gorillas who had them, and they died very, very quickly. Well, largely we've done this to unskilled men across Europe. We've, in effect, denied them status. So the most oppressed group in the United Kingdom in terms of educational advancement are working class white males. And minorities outcompete them, everybody outcompetes them. So the subtle point about social conservatism, or I prefer to use the word social conservation, is we've got to find a way to break that atomizing logic and that centralizing logic in order to distribute worth more widely to human beings. Because the point is, if we enter this world, as you described, that this fantastical world where we, are all at the very top, it's like the poor people who become actors and think actually they'll make this tiny percentage that make it. You're always going to be unhappy. So I think that's actually quite a profound remark. On the notion of solidarity and subsidiarity, of course I agree with these terms, but they have to be populated by real values. Liberalism philosophically cannot do solidarity. It can't philosophically. And my point to the last question is, there are varieties of liberalism, but they all rest on the foundation I described. They all rest on the idea of will is the ultimate foundation. Let me give you an example. Rights-based discourse. Rights do not tell you what is right. Rights by themselves can't give you the order of rights. If you just stay within rights-based language, you can have a right to wear orange socks on Tuesdays that is equal to the right to life. You need a prior account as to what is valuable in order to order those rights. And so the point I'm trying to make, I'm not a liberal, I don't favour anything totalitarian, is that liberalism by itself will not solve any of your problems. I'm a third order liberal, and I'm telling you, Europe can't be a first order liberal. We need foundational statements that populate the content, that are broad, and that includes diversity. That's the only way to secure ourselves for the future.
So at least in Britain you can be happy with this wedding.
Well, I believe in the monarchy. I'm a monarchist.
He's not a liberal, he's a monarchist. Well, I watched it as well, it was beautiful.
Just interestingly, 8 out of 10 of the top countries in the UN Wellbeing Index are constitutional monarchies. That's not an accident.
And that is what I wanted to suggest to the European Union. That might be a solution. So we have to agree on a king. Yeah? And the seat of the kingdom. Yes.
This is innovative.
Yeah, everybody is talking about administration. I'm talking about a solution. Let's talk about a kingdom. Why not? So, but I mean, I was listening to you, and I have even more questions than answers, to be honest, because well, as the gentleman said, it's not important to talk about values because they are clear. I don't think that's clear. I think that the population don't understand, for example, the word subsidiarity. Not at all. I don't know, I mean, it's not that... Yeah, they should recognize, I mean, you can recognize something which you understand. If you don't understand something, you can't recognize it. Anyway, I would be happy if, for example, more democracy would be transformed into respect of law. Would be also good in our country. rise education, maybe more explanation, less talking about what was wrong than what is good and what we achieved. And of course, the question is whether we are controlling something or not. I think this with the broad usage of social media, Industry 4.0 and artificial intelligence, I don't think that we are that much in control whatsoever. And then, of course, if you look on the media scene, what in the media, so where I'm a little bit skeptic on that future development, but I would be happily surprised if it will be the opposite. Because as my point of view is somehow there is some sort of a disease what we do have. We are infected with a virus of I don't know, hesitation and don't trust each other into the future. This is something what is the role maybe of the leaders to give us more courage that we will reshuffle, no? As Angela said, and then we're facing to a major crisis. I don't wanna say that it should be done like that, but at least those who are in power at the moment and those who are leaders, they should somehow cure this situation by giving us more confidence and trust, or giving us or the people living in Europe and who wants to remain in Europe and the European Union, there's more trust and confidence that we really will make it. They will not let alone. And there will be somebody who is next to them, as in a family. It's not the question of a treaty, of a pact. It's not a question of a contract. However, the Germans always said we need a vertrag, damit wir uns vertragen, yeah? Because we need a contract just to get along with each other, in a family. And it's important, and it's beyond the contract. And this is something what we have this is the role of those leaders who are actually they have that's the role to explain it. As I said, to give more confidence and wisdom for all, because all the talks are for nothing if there are no action.
It's always with a good discussion. There's more questions up in the air than answers. So I think we have time for one more question, but before I would like just to ask Sean, each panelist. So we had words like sovereignty, freedom and unity. So is France more going to advocate the EU federation, or what was it? Where was it really heading? As for, we have to read. I don't see the gentleman behind the pillar, so I will give the floor to him. And I think it's the following speaker, so you will get the preview what you can await after our panel. So I'll be short, but I would like to really hear the French position, and of course, you can clearly see we could expand on this issue for a very long time. So before we will give floor to you and Mr. Ambassador, you all are very much welcome to continue over the coffee break, and please talk to our panelists before they will leave.
The question is, are we going to advocate for European Federation on the 19th of June? Right. I think the short answer is no.
Thank you. I have a question for my colleague, Mr. Blanc. So, for those of us who do not share at least the theological underpinnings of your political worldview, those of us who are deracinated or postmodern, transnational elites, or liberal in character, and maybe not rooted in a place or a particular polity like you speak about people needing that space. For those of us who see that your argument has a great deal of credence and credibility, how do we reimpose those kinds of values when we don't really believe in any kind of Judeo-Christian anything? I can't, that's a sort of Straussian move where we should make the Popolo believe in some sort of postmodern return to Christianity because we don't.
What I am trying to do is generate real liberty. I am not trying to generate a Christian totalitarian vision. Okay, I am trying to explain.
I didn't.
No. This isn't. I am trying to explain why liberalism has produced illiberal outcomes. What I'm trying to say is, if we are truly to speak to the needs of young people, believers, unbelievers, the only way to do that is to have value consensus. And what we've got now is value fragmentation. And I think the goods that can emerge from my philosophy, I'm basically a communitarian, that's not a communist by the way, a communitarian. I believe in shared national and international values. Only out of that can we start to create outcomes that will work for people. So what we have at the young at the moment is they can't, for instance, buy houses in large parts of the developed world because they don't earn enough, because the economic system has depressed their wages and they can't gain access to assets. The old answer, the post-war answer, was increase everyone's education, move them higher up the value chain. That has also broken. So we're creating conditions in which the world is ever more difficult for the young. Now, I don't have to be a Christian to see that that description is accurate. What I'm saying is that if we can reconstitute a broad agenda that includes liberal elements, conservative elements, socialist elements, that is how we achieve that consensus. And Europe had its growth period, its golden age, because it had values consensus. What liberalism has done, pure liberalism, and I'm not a liberal, has produced values fragmentation. And if we really want to do the work, and I really enjoyed what the Mayor said, because she spoke to this unbelievable sense of disconnect. If we really want to do that, we have to do organic communitarianism again, whether it's of left or right, I don't mind, whether it's believer or unbeliever, I don't mind. Because that is the new European project. If we don't do it, what will come is that on a national level. So I'm enjoying speaking to the Poles at the moment, and what I say to them is, for goodness sake, for Christ's sake, that's what I should say, for Christ's sake, don't become narrow nationalists. Don't retreat into a nationalist account, but take your account out as part of the European offer, because that is a genuine Christian democratic vision. Remember, Christian democracy emerged at the end of the Second World War as an attempt to produce a third way, a Rhineland model, etc. It's failed now and it needs reinventing, but that's what I want to create. I don't want to create a world where I win and you lose. I want to create a world where the possibility for us agreeing is there.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will still find time for quick coffee before the next panel starts. Thank you very much for your attention and all the questions, and a big applause to our speakers.